Good morning from Washington, D.C., and good afternoon or good evening to all of you tuning in from elsewhere. Thank you for joining us in this discussion today on America's Back, Perspectives from Southeast Asia. I am Elina Noor, Director, Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Since coming into office, President Biden has declared several times to the world that America is back. He said this in his February 4th address at the US State Department, and he repeated it at the Munich Security Conference almost a month ago to this day. At last week's first ever Quad Summit, which was also President Biden's first multilateral summit hosted since taking office, we heard a reaffirmation of, quote, strong support for ASEAN unity and centrality. Additionally, we've heard the administration's commitment to expanding US engagement with ASEAN on a range of issues, including in efforts to mitigate the crisis in Myanmar right now. But what does America being back really mean for Southeast Asia if, as some have observed, America's military presence never really left the region? Or if America's Asia policy continues to be premised on competing with China? What practical areas can the US and Southeast Asia work on together, even as countries still remain inwardly focused, first and foremost, on mitigating the domestic health and economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic? In this town in Washington, D.C., conversations on Southeast Asia tend to be subsumed or overshadowed by the China conundrum. So I'm particularly delighted and grateful to have a panel of established and next generation experts of Southeast Asia in Southeast Asia who will help unpack today's topic from the region's perspective. Dr. Shafiah Muhibat is senior researcher and head of the Department of International Relations, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Indonesia. Ms. Charadine Pich is Deputy Executive Director at the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace, in charge of research, training, and publication. She is also the coordinator of the Global Center for Mekong Studies. Dr. Aries Arugay is Professor of Political Science and Associate Dean for Research, Extension, and Publications in the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. Dr. Thuy T is Associate Professor of International Relations at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, currently posted at Vietnam's permanent mission to the United Nations, World Trade Organization, and other international organizations in Geneva. Dr. Koga, who is Japanese but an honorary Southeast Asian to many of us, is Assistant Professor at the Public Policy and Global Affairs Program, School of Social Sciences, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. We'll kick off with a round of framing remarks by the panel, and then we'll welcome your questions and comments that I will bring to the attention of the speakers. Please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to type in your questions at any time, and I'll try to get as many as possible in the last half hour of the event. So, Fifi, let's begin with you if I could. Indonesia is ASEAN's largest member state, but also the world's fourth most populous country, the world's third largest democracy, and most populous Muslim majority nation. As Southeast Asia's heavyweight, what is Jakarta's expectations of the Biden administration's first year in office for Indonesia-US bilateral relations, but also for the region? What practical areas of cooperation do you hope to see develop?
Thank you, Elina. So good evening. That's from where I'm at the moment, and good morning to everyone joining in DC. A pleasure to be part of this panel today. So thank you again for the invitation for me to be here. I'll try my best to answer your two questions with 3 points, I suppose. The first one is, explaining about, Jakarta's current priorities. 2021, what are the priorities in Jakarta in terms of foreign policy? Second point would be, based on these priorities, what are Indonesia's general expectations towards, relations with the US, both bilateral relations and also in terms of the regional relations with regards to ASEAN. And then the last point would be, what are the opportunities for new types of cooperation, for example. So the first point on what are Jakarta's priorities at the moment, and I'm referring to our foreign ministry's beginning of the year statement. They usually do this every beginning of the year, explaining what are the priorities for this year. So looking at 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, the priorities are all somewhat related to recovering from the pandemic. They explain 5 points in terms of the main priorities. The first one is health security, again, related to the pandemic. Second one is supporting economic recovery and sustainable development. Third one, reinforcing protection system for Indonesian citizens abroad. Fourth, contributing to the advancement of various regional and global issues. And then the last one is ensuring protection of Indonesia's national sovereignty and territorial integrity. So these are the 5 main priorities of Jakarta. So looking at this list of Indonesia's foreign policy priorities, it suggests that Jakarta is currently do not yet have a particular strategy to engage important players in the global and regional political scene. There has just not been enough clear translation or breakdown of what it wants from others. So I think this includes the expectations in general towards the new Biden administration. What exists is actually, if you look at the priorities again, what exists is actually an attempt to define domestic needs, recovering from the pandemic, recovering with the economy, and so on. The attempt to define these domestic needs into foreign policy objectives, similar with how ASEAN has left a lot of things also undefined. But Indonesia's strategic interest at its core is quite straightforward, and I think it still remains the same from the previous years. Regardless of the new administration in the US, Indonesia has strategic interest to balance its engagement with major powers. So bebas aktif is still the #1 doctrine. Currently, we are, you can see from the policies, very still oriented towards East Asia as our direct neighborhood after Southeast Asia. So even though they are using the new terminology of Indo-Pacific, but you can still see that East Asia is still very much the most important engagement for Indonesia. So, and then from looking at this, Indonesia's interest, again, is to balance engagement and thus the influence of major powers. Currently, on the back of the pandemic, Indonesia is still preoccupied with seeking cooperation with any country, including the US, in the providence of public goods, including for related to recovering from the pandemic, both for its own good and also for Southeast Asia. So this mostly will take the form of health security and economic recovery frameworks. So for example, in terms of health security, vaccine procurement is a #1 agenda. Special arrangements for the provision of essential health goods and medicines, and also agreements for cooperation for research and development, technological transfer, or joint production of vaccine. On the second issue on economic recovery, collaboration with major and middle powers, major powers, of course, including the US, is basically to put up diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve some of the region's probing crisis points or issues, mitigating external pressures from major powers towards pertinent issues in Southeast Asia. So this include, among others, also ensuring balance between collaboration with major powers in international standards of law, rules and norms, with respect towards local diplomatic or regional multilateral process. In this regard, the biggest example would be, of course, the case of the South China Sea. And then on the priorities regarding contributing to regional security issue, I guess this is where the common interest with the US we would find the most. So basically for this, again, the South China Sea issue is a #1 priority. And then from that, I suppose there are more detailed points that can be elaborated in terms of the relations between the US and Indonesia. Sorry, I skipped a little bit on the objective or priority on the economic recovery. Indonesia is interested in seeking trade facilitation, seeking facilitation of cooperation in new platforms. Even though Indonesia is very proud of signing the RCEP and the outcome of the RCEP, it still seeks to build closer economic relations with other major powers with the objective of full economic recovery. So, and then apart from this, particularly sort of like a bilateral relations of Indonesia and the US, there is also, ASEAN is still the #1 vehicle for Indonesia in terms of its foreign policy. So in engaging with the US, it's also for us, it's also about the future of the regional order and how, the US interacts with ASEAN as well. Indonesia and generally, Southeast Asia would like to have more say in the framing of the future of Indo-Pacific cooperation. And in this regard, what worries Indonesia the most is the actual trajectory of President Biden's new administration is the gap between a Southeast Asian emphasis on multilateralism through inclusivity with that of the US alliance-based order. So how do we really define cooperation in Indo-Pacific? I think this is what would be on the top concern of Indonesia. In general, the US is expected, I think, by a lot of Southeast Asian countries, the US is expected to think about the risk of scaling up China's military capacity projection, for example, in the South China Sea, or disturbing regional peace processes measures on the ground. Therefore, for Indonesia, the best scenario would be for the US to have more coordination with partners in the region, ASEAN members and not just allies of the same goals. Worst scenario for Indonesia in this regard would be that the US actually triggers more Chinese military presence, but then back away to being distracted elsewhere, Middle East, Europe, or other regions, and disappear, leaving a more aggressive and insecure China for Southeast Asia. And I think this concern has also been expressed by a lot of Southeast Asian experts as well. So coming to my last point, opportunities, what opportunities are there? Basically, the international relations is now filled with or characterized by a lot of mistrust. And I think, this lack of trust is something that all countries need to work on. So I think there is an opportunity to recover trust, including among the US and Southeast Asian states. Trust of the US presence in Southeast Asia will come from more care and attention of the US towards Southeast Asia. This ranges from not only a number of high-level official visits and attendance to regional platforms or policies. Those from Southeast Asia recognize, how important it is to actually attend these various forums and frameworks and meetings in Southeast Asia. And I think the number of high-level attendance really matters. It also takes into account the placement of senior officials in the US Department of State, Security Council, and the Department of Defense with some knowledge and known interest over Southeast Asia. Today, you can see most experts are basically usually on China or on India, and also placement of important and senior individuals in the region. So this is, of course, in addition to actually allocating resources to Southeast Asian related programs, but also, efforts like increasing studies, programs, centers of Southeast Asia in the US. Currently, there is a strong sense that Southeast Asia is being left behind from the US horizon, way below not only allies like Japan or South Korea, but also a number of other countries in Asia. So there's also an opportunity to rebalance sphere of influence. In essence, Southeast Asia hopes to expect a new course of action for the US that reflects a showcase that Southeast Asia is also part of the US vision of its sphere of attention. This should include, for example, gestures that the US will have more thoughts on regional interests that may mostly be born courtesy of geographical proximity, such as financial resilience, connectivity, and movement of people. A simple case, question, is the US thinking about the vaccine distribution in Southeast Asia? Or is the US thinking about providing, allocating a version of vaccine that may well be suitable for the condition of distribution in Southeast Asia? So these are the questions that are, I think, on the top of the concerns of a lot of countries in Southeast Asia. So maybe I'll stop here, Elina, and looking forward to more discussion later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fifi. Those were some really solid policy recommendations. And maybe in Q&A, we can unpack your important point about the gap between an inclusive multilateralism that ASEAN prizes and the seeming alliance-based multilateralism of the United States. From Southeast Asia's largest to one of the region's smaller countries, Charadine, US-Cambodia relations in recent times have been marked by tensions surrounding political developments in Cambodia and perceptions of Cambodia's over-reliance on China. What will it take for Cambodia-US relations to improve? Are there specific issues that both countries can concretely cooperate on for the benefit of Southeast Asia as a whole?
Thank you so much, Elina, for the concrete introductions. Good evening from Cambodia. In fact, and the question itself is rather tough, but I would begin by emphasizing that to many experts, Cambodia-US relations is at a crossroad, or some even it's at a critical point. The bilateral relation-wise has been up and down, and there's a lot of love-hate relationships involved. Historically, of course, because of the US deep hand in the Vietnam Wars, which including the spillover effects on Cambodia, the domino effects and so on and so forth, the debt left back during Khmer Republic regimes, and all of these things further added up to the tensions. But the increasing attention has actually arisen in the last few years, with, as Elina has mentioned, with the recent political development in the country. Last year marked the 70th anniversary of Cambodia-US relations, but unfortunately, with relatively strained bilateral tie along the line, especially with the new appointment of the US ambassador to Cambodia, which to many, looking at his background, he was one of the most senior Southeast Asia expert based in the Department of State. But he was appointed to be posted in Cambodia with the hope, I think, to revitalize the relation that has been strained from the previous mandates of various ambassadors. And so not to put the blames on various ambassadors, but just to look at, so with Patrick Murphy, the recent appointment came in, the EU ambassador kind of more or less shifting more toward public diplomacy rather than touching upon the core issues of, let's say, human rights or core political development as such. But in fact, it was also, I think, it was also due to the US unfortunately torn policy of framing Cambodia foreign policy from the prism of Chinese increasing influence and stronger tie with the country, with Cambodia. And that, in fact, has further breaches the trust and erosion of confidence building measure, which both countries has tried to build and try to recover, in fact, for the previous years, several last year or so on. In the past 2 years, the US has consecutively, like for example, expressing deep concern over the suppressions of opposition's party and Cambodia growing economic reliance, development assistance, and as well political support from China. And as you all may be aware, the recent allegations of a secret military deal between Cambodia and China, allowing Chinese military presence, which the US accused us of allowing Chinese military presence at one of the naval bases in the countries, has in fact sparked increasing tensions. Of course, when you're looking at the US core principle and value of promotions of democratic institution and respect for human rights in Cambodia. The recent political situation in Cambodia was considered as moving backwards by the US. So US on one hand kind of disregard the various progress made by different factions and rather just putting blame. So in fact, all of these added further strain to the relations between the two countries. Now, when during the pandemic, despite the lingering issues, the US continued to remain engaged with Cambodia on various development and cooperation aspects. Like I said, with the new ambassador, he's been trying to shift a little bit away from the core and hard issues and hot stuff like human rights and so on, but the development and cooperation aspect was still there. Areas such as education, public health, environment, law enforcement, especially demining and humanitarian assistance was still a core issue where US was looking at and try to strengthen relations with the countries in all of those aspects instead. With the pandemic, with COVID outbreak, at least 20 million was provided by the US toward medical and public health responses to, and as well the mitigating various economics impact of the countries. So this just a glimpse of what both countries, both the opportunity and challenges that both has been trying to looking at. Now, in the context of ASEAN, with Cambodia being in the upcoming chairmanship of ASEAN, we're still yet to see whether Biden administration will actually doing things to revitalize the relation and also putting a deeper hand in ASEAN. Now, with Trump administrations, I mean, like it or not, was evidently a bit kind of absence from the region in that regard, where Trump was more focusing on issues like North Korea, demilitarizations, things in the Middle East, but really less on in the region, with the exceptions of South China Sea issues and, of course, Chinese increasing influence in the country. So I think I would say that the overall present or U.S. foreign policy was trying to look at Southeast Asia from the Chinese angle, which is a bit short-sighted and kind of diluting the relations with many countries in the region, including Cambodia. I would also say that when looking at ASEAN, yeah, as I said, because we will be the upcoming chair, it will be on the key agenda of Cambodia foreign policy. And the US could do a lot more in the upcoming chairs and of ASEAN, including trying to strengthen with other development partners and really need to shift away from the aspects of zero-sum games in Southeast Asia, I would say. Last but not least, my point of revitalizing the relations between these two countries, I think we really need to abide by the principle of mutual trust and common interests. The two-country relations will need to be nurtured and cultivated, not only between government to government, but also between people to people. I would say the US has been doing good in winning the heart of Cambodian people through various development assistance, but of course the relations between government to government was a bit strained because of the internal affairs of the country. So if this is the case, then perhaps US can compromise on these various issues and acknowledge the progress been made rather. Other point would also link with proactive diplomacy. We need to be strengthened more with in frank and sincere discussions. And I think moving away from this continuous allegations and so on, but some of the critical issues would better off be discussing internally or backdoor or backtrack diplomacy, if you like. Because, as I mentioned earlier, it seems like notwithstanding the political differences and lingering issues, development assistance and partnership was still one of the priority agenda. And with that regard, to revitalize relations, in fact, those aspects should still continue to be strengthened, and especially the know-how experience, as well as building human resource capacities and toward the nation-building process, etc. geopolitical dilemma. Of course, U.S.-China competition is inevitable, but it's really a reductionist and incorrect to view one country foreign policy from, again, solely from the great power competition, or in fact from the analytical lens of Cambodian domestic politics. And its diplomacy and international relations is complicated in nature, and there's so many things that involve. And as a small country, we do have limited diplomatic space to flex around, and U.S. has to take into consideration these differences, this different level of our stage in international arena, and rather put into context all of this in mind, so as to perhaps getting back or to strengthen relations that we once used to enjoy. I will stop here and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charadine. One of the strengths of conversations like this is what among track 2 and track 1.5 circles is what might be called considered candor. And we certainly appreciate yours, so thank you for that. Just a quick admin note for all those tuning in, please feel free to start typing in any questions or comments you might have, excuse me, in the Q&A box. Unfortunately, we will not be able to have you turn on your mic or video to ask your questions, but I will be keeping track of questions in the Q&A box. Aries, turning to you, US-Philippines relations has also been fairly tempestuous over the last few years. With the 60th anniversary of the Philippines-US MDA in August, what is the future of the alliance under the Biden administration, especially with the Philippine presidential and vice presidential elections scheduled for next year?
Thank you, Elina. Good evening, everyone. Good morning to our friends in the US. Magandang gabi po. It's a pleasure to be in this distinguished panel. Let me just get right to it, Elina. It's quite ironic that you mentioned that in August of this year would be the 60th anniversary of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the Philippines and the US, because that is also the deadline, supposed to be, of the process of the abrogation of the Visiting Forces Agreement between the United States and the Philippines that has been instigated by the Duterte administration starting of February last year. Though that was suspended already twice, that gives you an indication that the Philippines is still not quite sure what to do with its relationship with the United States under the Duterte administration. As what has been said by a lot of our strategic observers, particularly in DC, I'm quoting from a CSIS report in Washington, that the Philippines the US has the oldest and most complicated alliance relationship with the Philippines in Asia. But apart from history, a lot of the people in the conference beltway in DC would say that the Philippines is a key actor and an anchor of US presence in Southeast Asia. And that makes it quite tricky that you have a very unfriendly administration at present that started in 2016 with the leadership of Rodrigo Duterte, who, let's say, had complicated, might be an understatement, the relationship of the Philippines with the United States. However, it's not just black and white, because it seems like Duterte had a quite cordial relationship with the previous Trump administration when Trump visited Manila to attend a series of meetings in the ASEAN summit. And it seems like the Duterte administration is quite happy that the Trump presidency did not really intervene or criticize or make remarks about how the Philippines is being run under the Duterte administration. So therefore, when being asked how would the Philippines react to a new Biden administration, the proper question is, to whom are you asking this question? If you're asking this question to a very debilitated political opposition back home, this is a welcome development. After all, the Democrat Party has repeatedly mentioned with quite anxiety regarding the democracy and human rights troubles in the Philippines. However, if you ask the Duterte administration, or at least the people who are in the government of the day right now, they might not welcome a Biden administration as much as they would have welcomed a continuous Trump administration. Even if the Duterte administration is about to end its term by June of 2022, that will not stop Duterte from continuing to stir and conjure toxic rhetoric. And the latest of which is that he is asking the United States for 20 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine in order for the Visiting Forces Agreement to be reinstated. That seems to be the exchange right now and seems to be the priority of the Duterte administration. So let me just mention 3 dilemmas that are causing quite a stir between US and Philippine relations. I've already alluded to this earlier, but the democracy and human rights dilemma is quite clear. There are currently jailed or incarcerated members of the political opposition that some Democrat senators have already raised flags and wanted to be freed because these opposition leaders have been jailed unfairly. Moreover, members of the press, particularly Maria Ressa, found its way in the US budget last year in terms of the United States imposing some kind of subtle sanction to any official who were responsible for the troubles that are currently faced by journalists like Maria Ressa in the Philippines. So therefore, given that the Biden administration has majority of the Democrat Party, not only at the executive level, but at the legislature, I don't see any winding down of criticism between democracy and human rights of the Philippines under Duterte. And this is where it gets tricky, because that will be reciprocated by further rhetoric on the part of President Duterte. The second dilemma is the military dilemma. What's interesting is that, and this is why I say it's not quite black and white, is that even if at the level of the presidency, Rodrigo Duterte seems to be anti-US, there's a lot of continuity at the level of institutions and institutional engagement between the Philippines and the United States. Continued military exercises were seen even under the Duterte administration, and the bilateral security dialogue or strategic dialogue between the US and the Philippines continued. So one might have to separate the rhetorical fluff from the actual positions, as well as the actual measures being continued or put in place by the Duterte government, which could be differentiated from the Duterte presidency or the leadership of Rodrigo Duterte. However, this military dilemma has also exposed quite a troubling trend. At present, the Philippine military is not quite as focused with external defense as its public would want to be. If you look at what is the greatest threat, security threat to the Philippines, it's not really Chinese aggression. It's more so, according to the Duterte administration, communist insurgency and terrorism. And this makes the Philippine military more internal rather than external looking, which has an impact on democratic civil-military relations in the Philippines. The Duterte cabinet is the most militarized cabinet post-martial law in the country. In the Philippines, all the major leaders of the COVID-19 response are retired generals, and this has made the pandemic response less defined by public health and more defined by hard security. By being more inward-looking, this exposes the difficulties of reaching out to a military that would rally behind the US and its allies in trying to counter Chinese aggression, particularly in the South China Sea. So I think the military dilemma is that you have a Philippine military that is increasingly being more politicized and therefore less professional. And I think this is one of the negative legacies that this outgoing Duterte administration will likely leave behind. The third dilemma is the political succession dilemma. I like the question that you posed, Elina, because if you read a lot of US-Philippine relations policy briefs, there seemed to be hope that with the sunset of the Duterte administration and possibly a new administration by next year, that there could be opportunities to recalibrate, a reboot, a refresh button to be hit in terms of US-Philippine relations. Of course, the elections is still a long way to go. But if you look at the current polls, the likely replacement of Duterte might also be a Duterte. And it's the daughter, but there are also rumors or at least insinuations that President Duterte himself might run as vice president de jure, which might make him president de facto. So you have a Duterte tandem running in the 2022 elections. In spite of the pandemic, there are already rallies and people in the streets calling for this kind of tandem to be formed by 2022. So not to be a downer to the optimism that with the new administration comes a new beginning for US-Philippine relations, the more things change, the more they likely remain the same. And if, in fact, this is the reason, the main reason is because in the Philippines, ex-presidents tended to be imprisoned right after their term. So the solution is never to leave power as much as possible. Finally, I want to say that at present, there might be opportunities for the US and the Philippines to still continue talking and somehow not be too dragged with the dilemmas that I've posed. And this is where institutions come in. It's welcome that a lot of communications has started between secretaries of defense and state between the two countries, and that the bilateral strategic dialogue will likely continue in the remaining years. But I think right now the Philippines is just too preoccupied with its COVID-19 response. And it's the predefining issue right now. And I think the more that the US will help countries like the Philippines and in Southeast Asia deal with this pandemic, the more that a new beginning or America being back might be seen in concrete terms. With that, I end. Thank you, Elina.
Thank you, Aries, for posing even more dilemmas for us, but also passing distinctions for us that I think are often lost in commentaries, especially coming from the side of the world. So thank you for that. Thuy, if I could turn to you, Vietnam-US ties really seemed to blossom under the previous US administration. Aries mentioned the Trump administration a few times. And Vietnam has been quoted as a possible plus to the Quad arrangement. What is your assessment of the United States working more closely with particular partners like Vietnam to advance specific strategic priorities in the region? Would this, in your opinion, weaken ASEAN centrality in any way?
Thank you, Elina. Yes, good afternoon in Geneva and good morning to friends in Washington, D.C. and good evening for those who is in Asia. As you have just mentioned, Elina, Vietnam-US relation over the past years have been developing very fast and very positively, and particularly during the Trump administration, although he's had been adopting some kind of retreat policy multilaterally from Asia and Southeast Asia, but the relation with some regional states, particularly Vietnam, have been developed quite well. He visited Vietnam twice, one for the APEC summit in 2017 and one for the US-North Korea summit. So, and also during the APEC summit in Da Nang, Vietnam, he coined some like initial idea of the Indo-Pacific initiative. So, and last year, Vietnam had just jumped to be the 10th largest trading partner of the US globally. So with those momentum, it is expected that under the Biden administration, the bilateral relation will further develop. And in fact, the two countries have made some initial contact with the two foreign ministers, have exchanged a short call, and also during and also in the recently issues U.S. interim national security strategic guidance. The Biden administration also emphasized that U.S. would work with countries in the Southeast Asia, particularly Singapore, Vietnam, and other ASEAN member states, to deepen the partnership. And you also mentioned the possibility of involving the U.S. involving Vietnam in the Quad Plus mechanism. So it's important to note that although Trump coined the initiative of Indo-Pacific in Vietnam in 2017 during the APEC summit, but actually I believe that some of the effort to develop this strategy or this initiative has not been done by the U.S. under the Trump administration, but the U.S. partner, most notably Japan and India. So with the first ever leader level meeting of the Quad that just happening in few days ago, we can see that the Biden administration actually is taking the lead in reinvigorating this initiative and making it a little bit moving forward with stronger, more substantial substance. So I think that this Quad initiative under the Trump administration, under the Biden administration, will focus on the three things. The first thing is promoting a free and open rule-based order rooted in international law, which is what Vietnam and Vietnamese leader also promoting. If you follow the Vietnam's discourse in recent years, you will see that the Vietnamese leader quite highlight the necessity and the desirability of a rule-based order in Southeast Asia, particularly with reference to the South China Sea as well, and also the international law. And the second possible pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategy is checking China's rising influence and, if possible, assertive behavior in the South China Sea. But under the Biden administration, I think that he will focus more on strengthening the relation with bilateral allies as well as the regional partners, which Vietnam had been rising as one of the possible partners that may involve in the Quad Plus region. And thirdly, this is, I think that quite different from the previous administration, is that Biden may focus more on highlighting ASEAN centralities in this regard. So unlike the Trump administration, he rarely talk about ASEAN centrality, but the Quad statement have emphasized that they respect ASEAN centrality in regional architectures and also ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So I think that these are some of the continuation and also changes in terms of the strategic views of the U.S. From the previous Trump administration to the Biden administration. So in this regard, I think that Vietnam and the U.S. have quite a number of points of the strategic concern, mutual strategic concern and security concern. So they will work and foster on that. Probably we can expect that the U.S. will continue to conduct more frequent fund-off activities in the South China Sea, including port coal in Vietnam, and also capacity building for Vietnamese coal gas and military, as well as this is the new development that probably because of the COVID-19 pandemic and also the disruption of the supply chain elsewhere and also in China. So probably the US and its partner, including South Korea, Japanese company as well, will start to invest on the new supply chain in Southeast Asia, which Vietnam is a promising destination. So those are some of the likely possible avenue for cooperation. Of course, Vietnam-US relation also have some problems, including concern over trade issues, the trade deficit of the US to Vietnam, and also Trump administration accusation of Vietnam as a currency manipulator. And also we have a different perspective on human rights as well. But I think that the converging interests between the two countries outnumber the diverging one. So there will be more room for furthering the bilateral relation in the coming time. Now, moving to your question about whether the US strengthening of ties with particular regional countries will weaken ASEAN centrality in the regions. I think that at the moment, the regional architecture, security architectures focus on three pillars. The first one is US alliances and partnership system. The second is ASEAN centrality and focusing on ASEAN network. And third is emerging, Chinese initiative for force alignment, including the Belt and Road Initiative and also the IIIB mechanism. So under the Trump administration, because of his direct and confrontational approach to deal with China, so there has been a very quite fierce strategic competition between the two powers. So that have somewhat raising the concern among the regional states about the weakening of ASEAN centralities in the region. When you see that the two superpower coming into the regional architecture with their own initiative and neglecting the ASEAN role. But later development somewhat show that it seems to me that ASEAN centrality is still very much there. With the inclusion, with the signature and conclusion of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and also the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific and the ASEAN Vision on Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And as I just mentioned, under the Biden administration, because of his focus and his return to multilateralism, so and also his intention to treasure the ASEAN centrality in the region. So I think that somewhat the US move to foster relation with bilateral country will somehow complement to ASEAN centrality. It will not much weaken ASEAN centrality there, but it will complement to what ASEAN could not do at the whole group because of some problem inside the bloc and because of the institutional weakness of the bloc. So that in the South China Sea and in dealing with other security, including the traditional and non-traditional security issues in the region, but it had not weaken ASEAN centrality to the Red Deal, and also because some of the agenda of the Biden administration focus more on the multilateral platform, such as dealing with the COVID-19 crisis and also climate change and reform of international institutions. So I think that it opened the way for the US and ASEAN as a whole to foster their cooperation, both at the regional level and also at the global level, so that we will have the upcoming 26 COP summit in the UK, and we will have the reform, talking about the reform of the World Trade Organization and also of the WHO, the World Health Organization. So in short, I would like to emphasize that there has been some continuation between from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, but there have also some new development, which, in my opinion, is quite positive for the bilateral relation, both between the US and ASEAN as a whole, and the US and Vietnam in particular. Certainly, there are some divergent views, such as what I have just mentioned about the South China Sea issues, how to deal with China rights, as well as how to settle some political instability, such as the case in Myanmar. So those are sensitive issues that need, I think, that a more nuanced and dedicated response from the new administration. With that, I would like to end here. Thank you, Elina.
Thank you, Thuy. I think your point about divergent approaches, particularly to human rights and democratic values, will certainly be an interesting one to watch out for in the region, given the Biden administration's focus on these issues as a foreign policy compass of sorts. Kay, as a Japanese and honorary Southeast Asian that I've conferred upon you, talk to us, if you could, about the role of Japan in the region as an important partner to both the US and Southeast Asia. Has a change in US administration impacted Japan's approach to supporting a rules-based architecture in Southeast Asia? And, we just had the Quad Summit, as I mentioned in the beginning. Where does the Quad fit into the equation, if at all, in this respect?
All right. Thank you very much, Elina. Thank you for having me. I'd like to thank the Asia Society Policy Institute for having me this great panel. Because of the time constraint, I'd like to just quickly summarize what I want to say in this the panel. One thing that Japan actually wants to see in Southeast Asia is always the same. I think Japan wants to see the Southeast Asia regionally strong and also regionally resilient. That means Southeast Asia is not going to divide it by the great power competition. So Japan's kind of hope and Japan's willingness is to empower Southeast Asian countries in every way. So this actually the Japanese objective is pretty much stay the same. I think from the beginning in the post-Cold War, and then Japan tried to actually promote capacity building programs and also try to create certain kind of rules to empower the Southeast Asian countries in the defense the field and also the economic field. This is actually pretty much matched with the ASEAN's aspiration too, because if you take a look at the ASEAN's political security committee blueprint also, you could actually see the ASEAN wants to achieve or create a rules-based community in the future. So even though, again, I understand it's an aspirational level yet, but I think the empowering that is Japan's kind of means to achieve its own kind of strategic interests as well. So if you take a look at the Japan's kind of actions in the past, you could actually see in the defense field, you could see Japan launched the concept or the vision called Vientiane Vision in 2016, and then upgraded it Vientiane Vision 2.0 in the 2019, which tried to promote the defense diplomacy and also the capacity building in terms of the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and also the maritime security, and then the law enforcement capacity building as well. Economically, Japan tries to promote the RCEP and also the CPTPP in order to ensure the prosperity in the region. And in order to promote the development, kind of address the development gap between the ASEAN states, then Japan launched a partnership for the quality infrastructure, so that maybe it might not be as big as the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but then the Japan focused on the quality of the infrastructure and try to promote it in the every the part of the Southeast Asia. So if you take a look at this, I think the it doesn't actually the Japanese posture is not going to change much, even though the U.S. administration changed. So that said, I think there are certain kind of the change, obviously, like we actually going to see in the Southeast Asia. And then as everybody actually in this panel said, the Biden administration is going to focus more on the multilateralism. So we would expect the Biden is coming to the ASEAN-led the forums, including the East Asian Summit and also the ASEAN, East Asia Summit, and also other regional the frameworks like APEC and etc. So in that sense, we will see the Biden's U.S. presence in these forums, and that gives us the great opportunity to coordinate the policies and also the have the policy discussions with each of the ASEAN member states. But then at the same time, there are also challenges. I think like there are two challenges. The one is the Biden administration is going to put more emphasis on the democratic value and then also the human rights. So if this is the case, and then if the as we saw the U.S. sanctions on the Myanmar, it's pretty quick, and then it's actually try to send a signal that like U.S. is not going to step back in terms of the value diplomacy. They are going to place more emphasis on this kind of the value diplomacy in the future as well. So that's the one challenge, because the ASEAN diplomacy is not like pressuring on the particular state in terms of the democratic value. Also, they want to encourage, but they don't want to put the pressure on it. So engagement is a kind of the means that the ASEAN actually put forward. And I think like this, to some extent, resonates with the Japanese diplomacy too. Japan wants to actually kind of support the ASEAN's approach. But one thing is that the Japan still values the democratic way of the governance and also the human rights. So in that sense, the Japan is not going to support this the human rights violation, or I mean, they are not going to defend that. So in that sense, in short term, maybe Japan could be the useful in terms of the negotiation over how we can deal with the Myanmar issue also. But if it's getting longer term, and if it's getting more and more the harsh, then probably the Japan would actually align with the more to the Western the allies. And the other one. The second one is the institutional arrangement. As we talked a little bit about the Quad arrangement, I think it is clear to some extent that the United States is going to put more value and then also the emphasis on its allies and partners. And then even though like Biden administration emphasized multilateralism, I think the priority goes to the allies and partners. And then this is completely understandable, because it's a closest ally, closest partner that like they could actually share their own values and then so on and so forth. So it's pretty natural. But like at the same time, I think we need to look up the how compatible they could actually be, the Quad and also the ASEAN. So that's going to be the one main challenge that the Quad and the United States is going to have. I think for now, if you take a look at the statements produced by the Quad ministers meeting and so on and so forth, you could see that the Quad countries respect for the ASEAN centrality and so forth. But then the question is, what kind of the ASEAN centrality they want to have? And then they don't actually clarify the role of ASEAN, and then they don't actually clarify what the ASEAN centrality means to them. So maybe even though like they are actually saying respecting for the ASEAN centrality, each member in the Quad may have the different kind of the understanding or like the idea about the ASEAN centrality. So this is going to be the big challenge among the ASEAN the Quad member states as well. And then I think like this is where Japan might be able to bridge the gap between the Quad and ASEAN. I think again, like the Japan is more kind of close to the ASEAN their partners in terms of the approach to the democracy and approach to the human rights, and also the Japan is actually thinking about empowering the Southeast Asia, and then it is actually the Suga administration or Suga Prime Minister Suga actually emphasized the importance of the ASEAN. And then he emphasized the communication with ASEAN in the Quad meeting as well. So if that's the case, I think the Japan could be the really good how do I say not mediator, but like they play a role in the having the connecting between Quad member states and also the ASEAN member states. And in that sense, I think the maybe Quad Plus could be the one kind of formula that the ASEAN can communicate with the Quad member states in the many ways. And then because I think the usually Quad can be seen as the anti or counter China the institution, but then recently the Quad summit actually created these three important working group. One is on COVID-19, and the other one is the climate change, and the third one is the critical and the emerging technology. I think these are the more like the non-traditional security issues. And then even if you don't actually agree with what the Quad people or Quad countries said, then maybe you could actually coordinate and you could actually input your kind of the ASEAN member states' opinion on that. So I think the communication will be the key. And then I think the Quad countries are open to that. So probably like the Quad Plus could be the one of the good device to actually interact with the Quad member states and also the ASEAN member states. So with that, I just stop here and I'm looking forward to a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. Your points about the possible differences in interpretation with regard to respect for ASEAN centrality among the Quad countries is an interesting one. And of course, we'll see more play out, especially with Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense being in Japan right now. Also, your point about Japan's potential role as a bridge and communicator between ASEAN and the Quad, certainly an encouraging one. Thank you all for your really insightful comments and observations. Let's open it up to questions. We already have a queue in the Q&A box, and I see that some of them have already been answered by our enterprising panelists while the discussion was going on. So thank you for that. Before we get to the questions in the box, let me throw one out that was sent to me much earlier. And whoever would like to respond to this, please go ahead. But the question is with, who's number one stance in Southeast Asian security and defense issues, potentially creating problems for individual ASEAN countries. To what extent will the new Biden administration and its Western allies treat US-China relations as a zero-sum game? So let's start with that broad question. Any of you would like to take a stab at this first? It's not in the Q&A box, but it was sent to me earlier. Basically, is there going to be a zero-sum game under the Biden administration? I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but Fifi, I see you smiling. So would you like first go at this?
No, I'm smiling because it's a difficult question to answer, actually. I'm actually not too sure. Looking at it from the Southeast Asian perspective, we sure hope it doesn't turn out to be, higher tension among the major powers in the region. I mean, all countries in Southeast Asia, we depend on, stability in the region to basically survive and continue development. There are a lot of expectations towards, the great power competition and where it should lead to. But I think, the concern of most Southeast Asian states, or I'm speaking about Indonesia in particular, is that, we continue to seek a balance in terms of this major power relations. And at the end of the day, we wish to have a beneficial relations with both US and China. And a higher tension in the US-China competition can only mean negative impact for Southeast Asia.
Thanks, Fifi. Thuy, you have your mic up. Did you want to chip in on this question?
Yes, I just want to mention that under the Trump administration, he has somewhat promoting such kind of idea about a zero-sum game between China and the US with the Sino-US trade war, and also like the forced alignment, like mobilizing allies and partners, like in somewhat like confronting Chinese rising influence. But it's important to note Southeast Asian respond to such a move is that they don't like it. They didn't like it, and they don't like it, and I think that they won't like it in the future as well. Because we say the zero-sum game in the mutual interdependent and mutual dependent region and the world is not good for the region, and particularly for smaller states and medium states like those in the Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asian have expressed that they don't like such kind of thinking about a zero-sum game between China and the US. So I think that it's also important to note that Biden had actually changed his approach on China before and after the election. Before the election, he is softer on China than we may think. And that also sparked off concern in Southeast Asia that his policy on China would be too soft, which on the other hand is not good for the region as well. Because if it were as soft as during the Obama administration, we would see some kind of like strategic ambivalence and with a lack of confidence in U.S. behavior, such as in the Scarborough Shoal affairs that happening to the Philippines. So I think that under the Biden administration, he will not push it to the zero-sum game level, but his strategic response would be more measured, less confrontational, but still, we say, as a reminder that China's change of status quo and rising assertiveness is not very welcome. That is my opinion.
Thank you. I think it would be detrimental to any US president domestically to be seen as being soft on China. So I think in Southeast Asia, we also fear the reverse happening, right, because of this image. Still on this issue of geopolitical competition, I guess. Fifi, there was an initial question for you about lack of trust and whether this could result in Southeast Asian governments either seeking bold engagement opportunities and partnerships or being more cautious. Would you like to take that?
Sure. I think it should be, a mix of both approaches. It depends more on what issues we're talking about, and it would be, the approaches used by a lot of countries in Southeast Asia would actually depend on the issue, not only on the sort of like a style or the approach itself. So when it comes to economic cooperation in terms of economic recovery post pandemic, of course states would are all sort of like quote unquote competing into the ways to recover the best from the pandemic. So, and I think states would would choose, this maybe some, types of bold engagement opportunities and partnerships, be it, gaining more investment in terms of infrastructure and so on. So there will be interesting, bold engagement opportunities shown. But in terms of other issues, such as the more sensitive security matters, you would continue to see, very cautious approaches. In some instances, actually trying its best not to have too many major powers involvement in certain issues. So I think it'll be a mix of different approaches depending on the issue.
Thank you. Charadine, there was a question specifically asked of you about China's naval expansion in Cambodia. Would you like to answer that?
On what specifically on the naval extension?
Well, the question just asks how Cambodia and the US might overcome China's naval base expansion in Cambodia, and whether this should be the main obstacle in Cambodia's and US relations.
I think that issue has been sort of resolved. Okay, not entirely resolved, but it was at least making clear to the public, at least the internal public in Cambodia, that there was no such thing as naval base. The government actually invited a public audience, interested audience, including media, news, and academia, and so on, actually visiting the site. Now, this is the evidence on the ground, but the questions of geopolitics and things that has been behind goes beyond that. Like I said, I think it was the new ambassador at least kind of try to shift away from this dilemma, because it's really an abstract thinking. There's no progress there's no affirmations on top of that. So they rather trying to avoid discussing this, but of course there occasionally been raised by different stakeholders in the region still. But it has been one of the reasons that's been diluting the bilateral relation between the two countries as well, and of part and parcel of interfering in the internal affairs of the country. But of course, the US has been viewing our relations from the Chinese side. So it would be, I think, to shift away from this dilemma. If it's not a good sign, then we should just focus on the things that provide a better positive affirmation. That would be my take. Thank you.
Thanks, Charadine. Couple of questions on Myanmar specifically, unavoidable, I suppose. Again, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but Japan is a huge investor in Myanmar, but the questions are really for our Southeast Asian panelists, and Indonesia's foreign minister has been particularly active with her shuttle diplomacy. Fifi, I don't know if you're ready to answer that, but Thuy, Aries, and Charadine, if you'd like to also contribute to this answer, please certainly do so.
What was the question more specifically, Elina?
So there were a couple of questions on Myanmar, but essentially the questions boil down to what can ASEAN do to alleviate the challenges right now in Myanmar and the challenges Myanmar is presenting to the region. Are 9+1 meetings a practical approach, for example?
Aries, go ahead first.
Well, I just want to make it known that in a quite about-face manner in which the Philippines has expressed its position regarding the Myanmar crisis. We all know that it has supported Daw Aung San Suu Kyi before, and when she was still under house arrest, and has sought to promote democracy and human rights Myanmar and in the region. But unfortunately, under the Duterte administration, the Philippines has invoked non-intervention, particularly, which is quite contradictory to what the Philippines is known for in supporting democracy and human rights worldwide. In fact, the Philippines was, together with Russia and China, did not support the UN Human Rights Council resolution on the Myanmar crisis. So I think if ASEAN will be relied upon in the sense of ASEAN as a whole, then we might see resistance from some members. And I do think the Philippines will not heavily support some form of intervention in Myanmar right now for many reasons, because it's living in a glass house and should not throw stones because its democracy and human rights record is also under the Duterte administration is also circumspect. But I think this is dependent on how strong some ASEAN member states really feel about the Myanmar crisis. And I think if there are certain countries that feel strongly about it and is willing to take the initiative, even countries that are invoking non-intervention like the Philippines might have to find itself to follow. So therefore, I think this is precisely the opportunity for some ASEAN members to step up. And I think some are, and some countries will likely follow because it might be too shameful to be left behind in this issue.
I'll add more to that, Elina, if I may. I mean, indeed, Indonesia foreign minister has did quite a few proactive responses since the coup in Myanmar started. This includes, trips to, we all know about the trips to Brunei, Singapore, Thailand, in an effort to gather support from other ASEAN members. And also calling for an informal ministers meeting, which occurred a couple of weeks ago. But this effort has, thus far faced mixed responses. You can, on the one hand, there are support from a handful of ASEAN states. On the other hand, it actually triggered demonstrations in Myanmar because, some of the efforts are clearly misunderstood. You can see from the informal ASEAN ministers meeting, they produced only a very dull statement. Which only highlighted, I think, the divide actually among ASEAN member states. And Indonesia's statements are only supported, like I said, by a handful of other members. So Myanmar has been quite a shock for ASEAN, that's for sure. But I don't quite agree with criticism saying that, ASEAN has failed or this is a portrayal of ASEAN's failure. Because I think that an institution can only do so much as the rules of the games allow. And in this case, ASEAN's rule of the game actually limit what can be achieved. All the bureaucracy with the ASEAN ministerial meeting show very clearly how efforts from Indonesia, for example, came to a very met with serious challenges by ASEAN's practices. So in this regard, I think there's not much. If ASEAN is what it is with the rules of the game, with the charter as it is now, there's only very limited of what ASEAN can do in this matter, I think.
Let me probe that a little. Brian Harding has asked whether a 9+1 meeting, 9 ASEAN member countries and the US, would be a practical approach. What are your thoughts?
Not under ASEAN's current practice. If you want to do that, you would have to go outside of the rules of the game, as I said, because the charter doesn't allow for that. It allows for an ASEAN minus X mechanism, but to come to that, you will have to get consensus that an ASEAN minus X can be agreed upon. So, if we can have 9 countries, 8 countries, how many countries +1, +2, but you have to go outside of the ASEAN framework.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to that? If not, let's move on. There's a question about the CPTPP and whether expansion of the agreement could be promoted in the region, given foreign trade and investment being controversial issues, not only in the US, but also in Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand. I actually going to put Kay on the spot on this, if you'll allow me, Kay, and you can certainly say no. because Japan was so instrumental in pushing through the final iterations of the CPTPP. Do you have any thoughts on this question?
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm not necessarily kind of focusing on the CPTPP process. So my kind of response could be pretty broad, but then CPTPP is really important, and then it's not actually countering or like anything to do with the RCEP. Japan is actually supporting both RCEP and CPTPP. The only difference is that CPTPP is more kind of having the higher standards, so that they could actually get the more kind of greater the free trade and also the greater kind of transparency, etc., and then also environmental protection, etc. So in that sense, I think that's kind of trying to be the model, like the highest model of the free trade and also the trade relations in Asia. So if anybody actually wants to get in, then like it is actually to welcoming kind of I think the move. So the question is when foreign trade and investment are controversial issues. Yeah, so we don't actually really expect the United States is coming in sooner, because there's gonna be probably the congressional the opposition to that, and also I think the Biden administration doesn't want to spend like too much political capital on this, so probably like this can actually put off for a while. While like they actually try to negotiate if there's any kind of the room to renegotiate or like get into this kind of free trade. So I understand like there's a certain kind of controversies in a particular item or particular issues in the CPTPP, but like, that does not necessarily mean that like, it's actually going against any particular countries or like any kind of regional states. So it's more like I don't know. They are welcome. I mean, the member states are welcome to have more members if they agree, and then China actually showed its interest in it. So probably like that's that's actually to me like it's a welcome move. I mean, if they want to actually get in, then that's actually okay. So
thank you, Kay, and I'm sorry I put you in a difficult position, but thank you for that answer. Thuy, I see you have your mic on. Please go ahead.
Yes, I think regarding about the CPTPP, I think that at the moment there have been some expression of interest to join, most notably, as Kay just mentioned, China, but also the UK, so that the more developed countries. And the question which have just been put in question a lot, that is whether Biden returned to CPTPP, because it's pretty much Obama has spent a lot of effort in pushing the former TPP. So, and now if you compare CPTPP or former TPP with the recently concluded RCEP, and we can see that without the US here, we can see, and the prospect of China joining CPTPP, it will make it like make regional country have a more feeling of China widespread influence, and also the champion of regional integration, and also like free trade instead of the US. So those are the issues of interest and also concern. Regarding the ASEAN member state, at the moment, CPTPP have only 4 Southeast Asian states, Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. And as the people who, the person who raised the question, free trade is not an easy issue for everyone. But at the moment, we can see Vietnam as also a Southeast Asian development state, but we join both CPTPP and RCEP. So, and it returned a lot of commitment and also domestic reform and structural reform have to be made in order to have such kind of commitment. So I think that it somewhat like this is kind of like a two-level, like two-tier, we say approach. It means those who can go faster can go first, and those who want to follow and who want to join may come later when they are ready. So I think that there is no hurry and there is no push for any Southeast Asian to have to join CPTPP. But as a country who have like a very free trade thinking at the moment, Vietnam see a great prospect in joining free trade agreement, both in terms of CPTPP and RCEP. So other countries, Southeast Asian countries, should look at the situation in their country as well. And if they want to join, we think that the floor is always open.
Thank you. I think to your point about internal resistance, especially in the earlier rounds of the TPP negotiations, is an important one. And this is kind of a forcing mechanism for countries to make those difficult decisions regarding structural reforms. So I guess it's watch this space for all countries involved. Malaysia itself has not actually ratified the CPTPP yet. So it's a wait and see game for now. There is a question about the US's economic stimulus plan worth $1.9 trillion and its and the global supply chain, which may affect how products are procured from Southeast Asia. Thuy, you touched a little bit on this, so maybe I can start with you, and anybody else who would like to jump in, please do so. But how do you think both the stimulus plan, the US stimulus plan, as well as its reassessment of global supply chains will impact Southeast Asia's economy?
I think that at the moment, because we say the package have just been signed and has just been approved, so we have not have some like detail insight into how it will impact Southeast Asia. But there is one thing that at least as a Vietnam watcher, I can see that it seems that the first thing is that the Biden administration has taken the pandemic more seriously, and also in leading the global effort in responding to the crisis. And Biden have just commit to provide $4 billion for the COVAX facilities. So with that contribution, which in turn will have the COVAX system, administered by WHO, to pour some of their supply of vaccine to lesser developed countries, including Southeast Asia. So that is the first benefit that I can see. The second thing, which is actually both an opportunities and also a challenge, because the stimulus package, at the one hand, it will promote economic growth in the US, but at the same time, it may raise a concern about the inflation in other countries, particularly those who have a lot of business with the US, including Vietnam. So that's a point of concern that I think that I have recently noticed. And the last one, I think that this will also somewhat contribute to the bilateral cooperation between the US under the Quad mechanism with ASEAN, because in the recently concluded Quad level meeting, leader level meeting, they have agreed to provide about 100 million doses of vaccine to ASEAN using Indian manufacturer and with the funding from the US and Japan, and also with the support of Australia. So I think that in many sense, the stimulus package in the US and also more broadly speaking, how Biden administration will lead the global effort in combating the pandemic will have both direct and indirect impact on Southeast Asian countries. I see more positive impact, but there are also some negative one which we cannot be ruled out.
Thank you so much. We're almost out of time. We have essentially about 30 seconds left. I want to leave these last few seconds to any of you who may wish to say a 10-second closer. So please, any one of you, before I wrap this up. If there are no takers, I will wrap this up then, since we are almost at time. I want to thank you all, my fellow panelists, for your penetrating regional observations. One of the upsides of this terrible pandemic is, even though we're not able to be together in person, we're able to cross boundaries and time zones through fiber optic cables, satellites, and I'm so pleased that we got to do that today. Thank you to all of you who have tuned in and asked your questions. I hope we were able to answer them satisfactorily. And hopefully this will only be the start of the conversation, because the Biden administration is still very new in its office and term. Hopefully we're able to continue this discussion at a future time. So my thanks again to all, and have a good rest of your morning in Washington. Good evening to the rest of you in Asia, and have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Elina.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.